Welcome to The Adoption Curve, the show where we explore how leading organizations are transforming their approach to turn technology adoption into a strategic advantage. In each episode, we'll sit down with a learning and enablement practitioner to get their inside story on how they're helping their organizations adopt and maximize their technology investments. Let's dive into today's episode. Matt, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely, Sean. I'm really excited. I always love chatting with you.
Yeah, likewise. I always get a few things out of, if it's not your LinkedIn content, it's the conversations we have on the side. So always appreciate those. Just by way of some context, could you spend a couple of minutes, just give us a little bit of background on you? You have an interesting story with some of your experiences I think would be worthwhile to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, I kind of tell the story with the background as well of whenever I'm speaking. So I started as a pilot in the Air Force. That was my first career. I was an instructor pilot in the KC-10 for about a decade. And then I became a pilot because I wanted to be an astronaut. And so when my time came to leave active duty, I wanted to go to the big game in town in space, which was SpaceX. This was back in 2014. So probably before most people had heard of them. They hadn't landed a rocket or anything like that yet. And so networked my way into SpaceX through by means of somebody asking me or saying like, well, we need help with training. Have you ever done any training? And I, of course, like, well, I train people how to fly planes. I can figure that out. No idea that learning and development is like a thing that exists. Like HR doesn't really even exist as a function in the military. It's like something else entirely. So got in there, completely fell down the rabbit hole of learning and development. I led the team at SpaceX, the learning and development team at SpaceX for a little over 4 years. Went to another startup in the LA area. And then about 3 years ago, started Better Everyday Studios, and we focus on helping technical individual contributors become great people managers. So we help them make that transition.
Yeah, I'm sure we could spend an entire hour just talking through some of the nitty-gritty stories of SpaceX and some of the aerospace things you've seen, I'm sure.
It was fun.
I think really where we wanted to take this conversation is some of our overlaps have been around a couple of core topics here. One of which has been a concept that we've done a session on before, which was behavior first design. And it's really the concept of taking the discipline of instructional design and figuring out how we can layer this into actual behavior change. And, I think especially with your time, at SpaceX, fast moving, high growth, all focused on initiatives and deadlines and deliverables. And then you have this kind of fuzzy, weird thing to wrap your head around, some hard skills, some soft skills. So I imagine, you got a firsthand kind of experience with some of those things. So first off, can you kind of frame up like how you think about that behavior first design? I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this really started before my time at SpaceX. I think my how I think about this came from my time in the military, where I was teaching people in a very hands-on environment, right? I'm literally teaching them how to not fly into the ground. Right? Like that's so it was all behaviors. And something that you would notice is, you take something really big picture where somebody's having trouble landing the plane. And if you watch them, it's hard to give feedback on something as broad as landing the plane. That might sound specific, but there's, hundreds of individual actions and behaviors that go into landing a plane successfully. And there was one particular instance where I was coaching this younger pilot through getting down onto the ground successfully, and they were kind of always just a little bit off in how they were approaching. And really the behavior that it came down to is one simple movement of the throttle, where they were just moving it a little too slowly. And they had transitioned from a small plane into a big plane. And one of the key differences is a small plane has less momentum. So when you pull back the throttle, it slows down really quickly. Whereas when you're flying a giant plane, it has tons of momentum. And so you have to be a little bit more aggressive in your throttle movements, or the plane just kind of keeps going and you wind up way too high or just in the wrong position. And so that's just an example of, really closing in on what is the behavior that you're trying to change. And until you isolate the behavior, you really have no idea what you're doing. In the corporate world, I think where this often plays out most often is in compliance training, where, whether it's the compliance officers or the lawyers or whoever it is, they just want mountains and mountains of information and bullet points which don't help anybody do anything. You don't need to know the regulation number that is forcing you to do this thing, let alone like the accident that caused the lawsuit that caused that law to be put into place. Like all that information, it's interesting, but it doesn't help you, and it just creates cognitive overload. And so really when I think of behavior first design, it's just like you have to get as specific as possible of the behavior change you're trying to make, or else you're just kind of groping in the dark.
That's completely fair. Yeah, we talk a lot about the concept of just like the ability for an average 16, 17-year-old across the world to just pick up and start driving a vehicle, right? Like a pretty complex machine, let alone something as complex as like an aircraft, right? But it's a smaller, sort of population. But the concept is the same, right? With the right sets of processes and breakdowns and rules of engagement, anyone, for the most part, can understand how to function and kind of stay within the rules of the road. And, it's breaking those things down. That's a simple example. But it's also like a very dangerous thing if you kind of veer off and don't have those things very well defined. And so you start to unpack that, like maybe a huge part of any sort of change management or huge initiative could be a matter of breaking down into these specific behaviors. So I was wondering, we talk a lot about this in the context of adoption, whether it's a large software that a team is bringing in corporate America, or whatever the industry might be. It might be a new CRM or a new set of processes, a new AI function. Insert the blank initiative that's trying to be passed, and how we sort of roll out the adoption of that. And we get very overwhelmed by documentation, and here's every single piece of literature out there. And then people just get totally overwhelmed. So be curious what your thoughts are expanding upon this from the behavior side. Where do we start? How do we start thinking about this when we have this enormous project or initiative?
Yeah, I think for tech adoption, well, I mean, a couple of things is I think, especially with technology adoption, a lot of people skip over the documentation or the training piece, because a lot of the software that we use every day honestly doesn't need it. If you think about really popular applications, they've spent billions of dollars and user tested against billions of users to make sure that the interface is so completely intuitive that training essentially isn't needed. That is not most technology. The vast majority of technology is not in that place, and so it is going to require some training. And I think you're 100% right in that normally we get bogged down almost thinking of it as a feature by feature kind of thing. And I think the place to start, the only way you can start to boil it down is to start with basic personas of who are the people, and then how are they going to be using it. So is this, a person on the factory floor who's going to be using a mobile app, or is this somebody sitting in a cubicle working on the desktop version? Is this a user that's going to put in their own stuff, or an administrator that's going to be approving things, or is it a manager that's kind of like an interim role? I think you have to start by breaking things down from a technology perspective into the people who are going to using them, into those personas. And then you can kind of prioritize like, okay, like what's the most common thing they're going to do? What's the second most common thing? And so I think that what often happens is somebody is going to make documentation or training for technology or software, and they don't have any of that context yet. And so they just kind of come to the home screen and just like start going through the menu one at a time, which isn't how anyone is going to use it. Everyone's always going to come there with some kind of intent. And so you have to have those personas so you can break down those intents and then design training towards that intent. That's going to mean you're covering the same thing many times maybe, and that's okay.
Yeah, we call that like the museum tour guide version of documentation, right? It's just like we show up and just like word vomit at you.
Yes.
And guide you around this very specific path. And it's like nobody uses anything like that, right? You would never go button by button. Okay. So we get to that point where we understand, all right, maybe we've got these sets of personas. To me, it sounds like you're saying, let's grab like the low-hanging fruit of the FAQs, right? For lack of a better word. What are the stuff we just get asked about all the time?
Yeah.
From there, as we get into the more sort of mission critical work or the initiatives that are moving business outcomes, be curious, your perspective on this, because we hear this a lot with L&D folks, which is, I have all this on my plate already. I have to take all this subject matter expertise, now this technology expertise, break this down. And I am not the IT expert. I'm also not in the business of running and answering support questions, which they end up being in the interim while these projects are being launched. So after they get through the FAQs and the obvious, you start to get into, okay, now we have to align like actual behaviors with these business outcomes. This is where I start to see some of the wheels coming off. So I'd be curious just broadly how you think about these sort of things from an implementation standpoint, helping L&D leaders kind of unpack that next set of like critical instruction, making sure that, you know, once the obvious is already taken for granted, what that next set of procedures is they focus on.
I'd be interested to go a little bit deeper and like understanding some of the experiences you've seen of like when you say this is like really where it comes off the rails, like what's an example of that if you have one?
Yeah, so if we just take something like a large system overhaul, like a CRM or an ERP in a big organization, we'll often see things like, okay, great, everyone knows how to log in and they know how to like add a contact or access a record or something like that. But now we have to drive like a process end to end to achieve a result. And this is where they like get the concept of the vernacular in a tool. And then they understand like there is a way to do it, but the actual mapping of that and making it like instruction that's helpful and aligned to adult learning, where we see a lot of people are just like, this isn't helpful. That 45-minute video did not do it.
Yes. And this is where I think, to that point, a lot of it has to do with not necessarily going deeper into the technology that you're implementing or training on, but understanding the use cases of that technology and making sure you clearly identify some kind of outcome. You need to have a hyper clear what's in it for me for these people, because very often at the beginning it is harder. At the beginning it does take more time. At the beginning they're wasting time using this new system, and they're just mad that even though the old like system was based on paper and they had to walk around and get 12 signatures, they knew how to do it. It wasn't confusing to them. And so ideally you should have like a really clear number. I was working with an organization where they had, there's a big tech implementation across a bunch of different softwares that one of the primary users of them is going to be these like kind of customer reps, where they're the people who are helping with all the sales and making sure everything goes through. And simply because people didn't fully understand the system, there was a lot of invoicing that just wasn't happening. Like they were just leaving money on the table because they didn't know how to code things the right way. And so and this might sound super out of scope for a learning and development professional, but it is 100% in scope. If you can figure out, okay, like what is a dollar figure that you are going to try to achieve? If you can let everybody know, we believe based on last quarter's data, we left $12.5 million on the table. So we're just going to like beat this one process into the ground to try to go get that money next quarter. And so I think it's two things. There's two things in that answer. One, it's getting really specific at the outcome that you're going to try to drive, since this is a business outcome that you're trying to achieve. And then two, being realistic about your resources and time and their resources and time, in that there's probably a dozen processes that are causing that kind of problem, and you cannot go after all of them. You're going to do one, right? And so you're going to do a 30-minute intro video, and then you're going to follow up 2 weeks later about another thing. And then at the end of the month, the manager is going to send a follow-up note to everybody saying, hey, remember, this is the big thing we're focusing on this quarter. I think with training, since a big thing with training is like critical mass, and I used the, momentum before, in many cases, you should either be doing way more than you're doing or nothing at all. Right. And I think a lot of training is like right there in the middle, where you're sending out a dozen different of these 30-minute videos on all these different things. It's like, no. Let's just do one and focus on it. And it's going to seem absurd. We're going to do this one process for 3 months. Yes, we're going to do one process for 3 months. I realize that that's probably not realistic. Most organizations would be like, no, you're dumb. Like, do it all right now. But if you can push the needle on that of trying to, one, identify a clear outcome, and then two, minimize the outcomes that you're trying to achieve at the same time, I think that's how you help keep it from going off the rails. If that fits with what, I think that, fits with what you've seen.
It definitely does. Yeah. I think it's been a while, but I think when I was on your podcast, we were talking about the empowering L&D folks to get a seat at the table, sell internally, sort of have some of these soft skills for communicating how they're going to be effectively change managers within the organization. And, I'm from a revenue team, like it's very obvious. It's like, I'm a number, right? I'm attached to a specific outcome That's why it's so easy to understand. And that's often why this department gets so many more resources than any other, because it's just super measurable. It's like, is the money in the
100%.
bank account or not, right? Like there's no
100%.
middle ground. There's no, did they really get the skill? What level of the skill did they get? It's not, there's nothing
None of that matters.
nuanced about it.
Yeah.
Which I think is a blessing and a curse sometimes. But I think what you're talking about is spot on, which is attaching to something that is tangible, like revenue or impact of some kind that's big and meaty that the organization cares about. Anything else you'd mention in terms of L&D kind of in this change management seat? Did you hear that being thrown around in any of the projects you work on or see?
Yes and no. I mean, I do think very often L&D is left out of the change management conversation, or it comes in too late. And I think that's one, when it comes to, unfortunately, when it comes to driving adoption of resources, which is a whole other problem, right? It's like we spent time going to the FAQ and nobody goes to the FAQ. So much of that is like, when is it ready? Because I think very often we launch software technology without that stuff being ready. And so right out of the gate, people learn the wrong behaviors, not the behaviors of how to use the system, but the behavior of what to do when they don't know what to do. Yeah. Where do I go? So yeah, we need to try to find a way to get into those conversations early. If we're not, then another place where this fits in is a discussion that I hear is, okay, we're trying to make this change. Do we address the current employees or the new employees? Like who do we try to create a solution for? And at least for me, if I have my choice, it's always the new employees. You start with a process to fix the behavior from the beginning, teach them, because if somebody's been there for 5 years without an FAQ in place, they're like never going to learn to go to FAQ. They just aren't going to. Whereas if you can start to drive that behavior right away with new hires, and then when you can try to catch up the existing employees, I think that's the only way possible you can start to narrow the scope of who you're trying to help.
We've been working on a theory internally that we've been seeing with L&D, enablement, change management. It's called different things in different organizations, or where it sits in the org chart. But it's this concept of like, when these big initiatives are decided upon, it sounds like from your side, you're hearing L&D come in as like a support function after the decisions have been made, after investment's been made, after it's like a due date is established. We've been thinking about like, how do we help empower organizations to go like, you shouldn't launch an initiative internally without the buy-in of how it's going to be developed, trained, and documented so that it will be successful and hit those things. Any feedback or anything you'd add to that?
So it's really interesting, and I'll bring this up at this point because I think it fits in really well. As we're talking here, a couple of weeks ago, I was presenting at ATD's Tech Knowledge Conference, and I got the opportunity to be on stage with Megan Torrance and Yasmin Gutierrez, who are two amazing learning development professionals. They helped, we all worked together, and they really led the charge on the development of, I think, this kind of like 3-part philosophy that I think is really important to think about whenever you're trying to drive these discussions. And it's a simple Venn diagram that has 3 pieces of the business, the people, and the technology. And so any change like we're talking about here, any tech change always starts with one of those 3 things. Like the business has some need that they're trying to achieve. People are frustrated with some kind of process, or somebody found some cool new technology that they just think would be like neat for their organization. And what you have very often, so we start with that from that point of view, and everybody would agree that if we just drive forward from that point of view, it's going to be a complete failure. If all you're like is, this thing is really cool, so what? Like nobody cares. And so most of the time we expand our minds enough to think about 2 of the 3, right? We have the cool technology. What's the business case going to be? People are complaining. Here's technology that can solve their complaint. But actually, even if you only have 2 of the 3, you're still going to fall flat, because if the technology case and the business case is made, that doesn't mean people are going to use it. If, the technology piece and the people piece are in place, the business isn't seeing the benefit, and so they're going to cancel it, right? If the business need is there and the people need is there, nobody knows how to use the system, or the system doesn't meet the intended needs. And so I think it's important to like always be thinking about those three elements of what's the business case, what's the how are we meeting that, how are we meeting the needs of the people, and then what's kind of like the core technology. And that's where you find the Venn diagram. That's how you solve the Venn diagram of like reasonable and helpful technology implementation.
That's beautiful. I love that three-legged stool analogy, and it's so accurate with what success looks like when you're trying to launch any of these things. It doesn't have to even just be a tech implementation, but just an initiative trying to get done.
Yeah.
Some kind of outcome, some kind of objective that's trying to be done internally. Were there any other strategies that came out of that in terms of maybe when one is missing, how they're coaching the other two components, or anything else tangible that came out of that session?
I mean, most of what we did is, so the whole session was actually a 90-minute session that was pre-planning. It's like we have a whole document that I can share with you that was kind of like, just giant series of questions that includes, what is the business case? What's the ideal outcome? Who are the personas? How are they going to be utilizing it? What's the level of support? When it comes to implementation, do we start with like a small implementation and then a larger implementation, then a larger implementation, which I think can be really effective. And so I can share that with you after this, because I think so much of it has to do with forethought, ideally. Obviously a lot of us kind of find ourselves in the mix of it. Like we said earlier, like L&D doesn't always come in until later. And then it's just a matter of, I think, stepping back and asking these questions in retrospective to try to identify, okay, where is the problem here? Oh, it's because we didn't identify the clear users and segment them out and provide appropriate training. Or we never really identified like what the business case was, and so it's, even if it's retrospectively sitting down and figuring out, okay, what are the key things with those three areas so that we can identify where the problem is.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's a pre-planning exercise in a perfect world when we're designing in a lab environment. Most things are already in flight, which is understandable, but doesn't mean we can't break out those projects and reorient or reset those up or break them into smaller components that we can try to organize or at least pre-plan a bit. So we'll link to that resource if you don't mind sharing. That sounds like a great one. We have a couple of guides internally that we've used at IRAD, specifically helping with that, because we usually, a big trigger we see with folks reaching out to us is that initiative or that purchase, it was just made or is about to be made, and someone came in and said, you have 90 days to get this done, and everybody's panic sweating in the background. They're like, what's the fastest way I can stand up stuff so this is successful? And then they're looking at a tool like ours to try to help with those sort of things. And so, which is great, but it's also like, but if we start earlier, maybe we can get the L&D or the person who is going to be effectively the deliverer of the information. If we could have got them involved earlier, they could also coordinate with, say, maybe the vendor's resources, right? Like this is the big drop-off I see very often is like, why isn't it partly on the vendor to provide quality implementation, guidance, resources, collateral, training, before the customer has to go in?
Now you're speaking my language, yes.
Effectively build that themselves. I mean, I know there's a customization element that the vendor is in no way going to be able to anticipate, but there's got to be, 40, 50% that they can help standardize in some way and then let them configure. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest complaint I have against most SaaS software, not all, but most, is that in their attempt to grow, they are trying to be everything for everyone. And so I always joke that whenever I'm looking for a learning management system, as soon as if I'm asking about different use cases or different things, as soon as I hear the words, we can build that for you, I'm done. Because I know, okay, so you are a software factory. You are not like the creator of a product that you think has like a core use case that is then going to solve these problems in this way. And so that switch suddenly divests a lot of these organizations from any belief in responsibility of documentation, and so then they're just not there. Because I totally agree with you. I think the best software out there has a clearly defined use case and user segment that they are going to go fanatically serve as best as humanly possible, and that is going to include great documentation and resources.
Pet peeve of mine as well. And, I work for a software vendor, but I've seen the other side of it. I've done some solutions consulting work for a number of years where it's effectively like service provider helping implement software for organizations, being that middle person between the end customer and the software company, which is a lot of what you do with some of your services. One of the things I always point to is early days. I used to work in the construction space, and I would always be fascinated by the person maybe like Milwaukee or one of the vendors selling tools, and they would go to a job site and they'd actually demo, and they would ask them about the scope of work of their projects. They'd ask to see bids and paperwork and RFQs, and they'd go, hey, we can help with this part, or like, you should think about using it here. And it was like bringing in a third-party consultant that they didn't charge anything for.
Yeah.
And it was just this layer of like, let me anticipate what you're probably going to experience. And by way of virtue, you're like, okay, cool. Well, I'll just buy more of what you have because you've helped me get here. And it's this, that's one of the things that's really been missing from SaaS, is it's this focus on like streamline and self-serve and get it out and move on and scale. And what you find is like most people actually really want the hand-holding. Like the knowledge article is rarely helpful.
Yeah, and even before that, even just like to your point, kind of like the strategizing, like I don't want to come up with the best way to categorize my employees or categorize my courses or create some theory on it. Like I want you as the vendor to have, now I should have the freedom to kind of do whatever I want later on maybe, but you should have a point of view of like, what's the best way to use this tool? What are the best use cases for this tool? If you don't have that point of view, then like, what are we doing here?
Point of view is a great way to put it. Yeah, that's one of the main things to be asking from these vendors. So
yes, I love it. Yeah.
Overall, getting the L&D or the folks who are going to be owning any of those initiatives from a documentation and execution of that know-how earlier in the process, wherever possible. Sounds like that was a takeaway we want to do. We'll double click on the three-stool approach. I really like that. I think that's very helpful. Putting a little pressure on those vendors out there to say, hey, you know, maybe this documentation should be a little bit simpler. We've even helped some vendors with like, hey, build a bunch of tutorials and then just make them consumable for your people, like that your customers should be able to take this for free. You know, there's a couple of angles to work in there. But as we kind of transition here, I know we've been talking about kind of the flow of work, behavior change, these sort of things. As we think about like the documentation function or the program of documenting, it's not a very fun one, right? I think most people do not enjoy making this. Even L&D professionals would rather be in the design space rather than documentation space. I'm curious how you've seen or maybe helped with some talk tracks for empowering L&D people to share the importance of documentation to organizations that maybe don't see it, or maybe that's why they're getting to the point where they're being looped into the end of a deal, end of a project instead of earlier on, because the documentation gets thought of as just like a support instead of actually like a fundamental piece. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, again, I think looping, you're trying to make, if you're trying to make documentation a thing in your company, you need to go after what are the things that can help make a difference in people's lives immediately, even if it has nothing to do with a particular project you're working on. So what are the questions that new hires have, that every new hire has, that you can answer in some simple documentation? Just make it a thing that people go to, that people remember. You know, if you're just trying to, for the first time, create documentation on this one project, and there isn't documentation in any other part of the business, then it's going to feel a little foreign. It's interesting when you mention it, though, because since I've mainly worked in highly technical organizations, very often there's a pretty large documentation function within business units, right? There's technical writers who are not part of the learning function, who are out in the business. And I think that's another opportunity to try to engage them and create relationships with them, because it's just like there's a common thing especially in larger businesses where there's multiple learning management systems or learning is spread across multiple places. The same is 100% true of documentation. And so figuring out where everybody's documentation lives, is some of it in Confluence and others of it in Google Drive, trying to start conversations. I've never worked at an organization. Well, I guess it was true in the Air Force. In the Air Force, you just say, put it here, and everybody puts it there. But in most organizations that I've been at, there was no strong central authority to dictate how documentation happened. And so then it's all about relationships. It's all about, trying to leading without authority, of getting to know people, figuring out where they are, making a use case as to why it's going to be beneficial to them to move this over into a new thing, because it's a lot of work. So I guess to kind of like bring all that together, it's a little bit about understanding your organization and where they are in their state of documentation, of does it exist, does it not? making it a real thing for all employees, and then trying to manage those relationships so that as often as possible, the documentation is in a consistent place.
Yeah.
If that helps.
I think consistency and location is definitely a big component of this for sure. And we talk about the maturity curve, like where you are on that. Interesting to hear you work with technical audiences about the technical writers or engineers, folks like this who very much default to documentation over, or like lawyers and legal over, maybe even the regular interpersonal relationships that they may have, which is funny because on our side, we usually see the opposite of that, which is more of like the Slack messages to try to get something done rather than like, hey, this should be documentation. So we really try to unpack that from like a process documentation standpoint, that the behavior change happens, to take this full circle, when we continuously reference back to what we want good to look like, right? And so one of the tips that we always talk about is like, when the questions come in, sometimes they're FAQs, sometimes they are a request from L&D, and you find out, or for L&D, and you find out it's something that's already been documented somewhere. Instead of just answering, referencing back to that same location over and over and over and over again. Has that been your experience?
%. I am very much a people pleaser. I have the horrible habit of question comes in on Slack and I just answer it. There was somebody else on my team, on a previous team. She was fantastic at, hey, by the way, just go look at the FAQ. You got to find the right way to do it. You want to just, you don't want to be like, go here. Like you can come off pretty poorly. Like you want to think about customer service and customer first and that kind of stuff. But especially if they're a repeat offender, very often the strategy that I've seen is just like, if it is a simple answer that you know the answer to, maybe the first time you're like, yeah, this is how you do it. By the way, here's a link to the FAQ. But then after that, link to the FAQ, link to the FAQ, link to the FAQ. It's just link to the source document. You have to do it. It's going to take a long time. Surprisingly few people are actually frustrated by that. I think a lot of us answer the question in the belief that we're going to come off as rude, or they're not going to think we're helpful if we don't just give them the answer. I have found that is not the case. As long as you're respectful and actually send them to something that will actually help them. If you're we've all had that experience where we're searching through help documentation of some software, something that we're subscribed to, and like the AI bot like links us to some document that is just completely off the rail. It's just like, this is not my problem. Like that's not helpful. But as long as you're linking them to something that actually solves their problem, I think people are not frustrated by that at all.
Could not agree more. I'm a giant documentation nerd, so this is a big one for me. So 2 things I would add. One is, yes, the reinforcement is fundamental, right? Like that's the whole core. Getting them back to that, answering the question is fine, but as long as you are linking, as I describe in this document, here is that information, or as is laid out in X source material, so on and so forth. The other 2 pieces I would say are, one, when someone brings in that question, if the source material was not clear, or maybe there wasn't enough of an expansion of that concept or the nuance of their question in that documentation, it's effectively the best place to source out those questions for building good instructional content for future cases. So one of the things that I really focus on with my direct reports is the second they ask a question that I don't feel like I have good documentation on, I try to build it like within 24 hours if I can. And then I put like, you asked about this, here was your question, here's what this looks like. Because I find it really helpful, because designing on a blank page is really difficult to think about everything they might need to know. But it's like, oh, that's a very specific question. Why don't I just build you a playbook for specifically that? And I find that people actually, it's a great like leadership hack in my opinion, because they're like, oh, you're invested in me knowing how to use this as a skill that's now in my repertoire to do my job better. So I think that's a good transition we make into this sort of leadership pillar side. Any other last thoughts on that piece?
I was just going to double click on what you just said really quickly, because I do think in the moment creation is really great. And I think one thing that bogs us down a lot in documentation and in general course creation is we're trying to make the final product first. And so we're spending all kinds of time of like, how should this be organized? What's the narrative flow? Where does this all go? And you're wasting a bunch of time because you don't know. And you just have to accept the fact that you are probably going to overcreate in the beginning, and then you prune back. You let the FAQ grow for a while, just answer every question in the moment. And then maybe 6 months down the road, you can be like, okay, now we're going to have a project to like streamline this stuff, really make it organized. You kind of look at all and you can say like, oh, these two are connected. Let's combine them. Oh, here, this usually comes before that one. Let's put it first. But you just, in most cases, you can't do that in the beginning. And if you try to do it, you're just going to be there forever.
That's a great point. Yeah. Also knowing and building in a culture, and I think this is, the leadership side, that is understanding that the FAQ and your documentation and your LMS is a living, breathing thing that is going to iterate and grow over time. And if this function is going to be supporting and managing that, which means by way of the growth of the company, you're going to be needing to adjust those things. So referencing it is, again, why they should be going back there to look at it, because it's going to change, right? And that is the single source of truth, and we can adjust that as we go. And so as we transition to thinking about this from like a leadership perspective, I know on your podcast, you do a great job of really helping technical leaders to kind of understand how they can become their own from a management and a soft skill perspective in the wild world that is managing people. I know you talk a lot about kind of first principle leadership. And as we transition into, okay, now I understand the principle of documentation and how I'm going to build this out for my team, but now I have to like actually communicate that. And whether it's to my direct reports or maybe globally throughout the rest of my organization, I'd love to just kind of hear how you think about this from your framework.
I mean, I think, and this goes back to something that you mentioned earlier that I almost brought it up then when you talked about, we only have 90 days to get this done. And I think in software implementation, especially in like HR tech implementation, we have the tendency to believe that things require really long timelines. I remember once interviewing for a role that it was a ID role that was going to be supporting the rollout of some new HRIS system at I think it was UCLA. And they were on like a 2.5-year timeline for the rollout, and I think that kind of thing is really common, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. And one of the big things with first principles leadership, two of the biggest things that I say are questioning your assumptions and going faster. And so what's an example of questioning your assumptions? When I was rolling out a new learning management system at one of my last companies, the original project plan included quite a bit of communication out to the company. We just kind of assume we got to tell people, we want to, hey, we're a month out, we're going to do this thing. Here's what you can expect. And then as we got closer to it, we hadn't gotten that part done yet. And so we kind of just asked the question of does anybody actually care? If no one knows that we're changing the learning management system and they come in one day, if it works and there's just a new learning management system there with all the old links are still the same, it just takes them to a new place. Are they going to care? And I think we all said no, they are not going to care at all. And so we just scrapped that whole part of the process. No communication to the entire company until the day of launch, right? And so I think you want to go through and really question what are all of the things that are required? Do you need to transition all of your courses right away? Do you need to go live for the whole company at once, or can you just do it with one part of the business? There's innumerable assumptions that we all make that I think you can question that can really make things go a lot more smoothly. And I think it's on leaders to push their people to ask those questions. And then the go faster piece is kind of a forcing function to help with that, of making sure you're only doing the things that you absolutely have to do, right? There's a saying in the engineering world of engineers love to engineer, right? There can always be a little bit better. It can always have tighter tolerances. Like the manufacturer, we could always update those CAD drawings one more time. But that's not the point. The point is to build things. And so I think the same is true for us is that, yes, there's always more we can do, but we need to exist in a realistic time frame. And so how do we do this faster? What if we need to do it in 30 days? If we were going to go live in 30 days, it's going to happen. God said we're going live in 30 days. What are you going to do? Maybe we find out that's not possible, and that if we went live in 30 days, the system would explode and everybody would be angry. But maybe not. I don't know. Maybe there's just some subset of work that we could do. And so I think, all that is, like you said, it's all about how do you communicate this stuff with your team. It can be, well, I'll stop there. I have one more point that I want to make kind of around the leadership piece, but I'll stop there and see if any of that resonated with you, if you have any questions on it.
Very much so. Yeah, I think that's a huge piece of this. Is it's very easy, especially in defined job descriptions and scopes of work, to go like, well, we have to do these 11 bullets. That's what we do,
Yeah.
right? And then you start
Yeah.
realizing like, who put the bullets there? Like, why is it
Yes.
that way? And those sort of things. So I 100%. I'd love to hear your second point, but could not agree more.
Yeah, the final point with all this is, so at Better Everyday Studios, when we teach leadership, we kind of talk about, what are the core foundational pillars of leadership, and we boil them down to building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. And in the scope of change management, I think that building trust piece is so critical. Change is always uncertain and scary and stressful, especially if you're trying to drive timelines or, making big things. And so as leaders, it is critical that you are spending time building strong relationships with your team, between team members, going out to team lunches, getting to know each other on a personal level, not just a work level, because those kinds of relationships are what give you the slack and the grace and everything you need to get through the time when the implementation is going wrong, when the vendor delivered something different than what you were expecting, when the upload doesn't work and you're in on Saturday trying to finish it. Like you build space for that to happen ahead of time. You build the trust ahead of time, which is why I think the first thing that every leader needs to be doing all the time is judging what's the level of trust in my team and how can I improve it.
Yeah, could not agree more. It's funny that you mentioned that Slack piece, because that is something I've not been able to figure out the right wording for that. I do believe that's the correct one, which is just effectively with good rapport and good trust with your team members, like a friend or family member that you have shared experience with, or maybe forced to if they're family. You give them grace, and there's just a
Yes.
level of Slack built into that relationship. It's like, you were late, you forgot to do a thing, that fell apart. We tried it and it exploded in our face. Like, you're just like, yeah, it's just part of doing things. But when you don't have that, it becomes this tit for tat experience in which you are, looking at them in this black and white give to get experience. And that is what I have found to be really challenging. And just like a huge cognitive load to be always on the defensive that this is, me versus them, versus like, it's a team, shit's going to go wrong and we're just going to figure that out. So I really like that Slack analogy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's exactly what I've seen. And even the most technical minded of people who think like, oh, relationships don't matter, it's just about getting the work done. I've seen it in the workplace. Like, it just, when you have trust, there's just less conflict. Stress just diminishes.
Yeah. Amazing. I like that. The feedback and the goal setting as well, obviously just kind of rounding out why that makes a nice tight experience for everyone involved, right? So they feel like they're empowered and being a part of something. And then obviously we're aligned to that same goal. So the communication is there, which makes complete sense. As we wrap up here, and maybe we've covered the majority of this here, but I historically have done a pretty terrible job of what I would imagine is thinking through first principles. I'm trying to train myself a little bit better with this. Anything else you would add there? I'm a newer leader with some small direct reports, thinking about, there's a lot of asks, a lot of things we could do. We can't do them all. And so trying to be constantly using a lens of first principle thinking. Any other tactics or advice there?
Yeah, I think I tend to think about it from, we've covered about half of it. I tend to think of it as kind of like, there's four main things that I'm always trying to think about it. And like you said, some of what we've already touched on. The first thing that you always have to do is identify the core problem. We talked about it at the very beginning, right? It's like, what are we actually trying to do? What are we actually trying to solve for? Because a lot of those asks maybe don't matter. I think ultimately, especially in L&D, I know I fell into this. I think the number one thing a lot of L&D people need to do, especially if they're trying to, get a seat at the table or do whatever, they, get more clout inside their organization, is you need to figure out what your boss cares about. You need to figure out what some high profile stakeholder cares about. That's now your problem, right? So it's, and then other things that I think a big part of leadership, the way I put it, a big part of being a manager is figuring out which fires you let burn. There's fires everywhere. You can't put them all out, right? And so identifying the core problem helps you figure out which things need your attention and which things don't. Once you identify that core problem, then it's about identifying all the constraints that are causing that problem. And some of this goes into questioning those assumptions of, do we need this signature? Who said we needed that signature? Is there somebody who can waive that signature being a requirement or could change this policy? Every single policy that is in place in your organization was put in place by someone, right? They had a reason for doing it. Maybe it was a bad reason. Or maybe that reason doesn't apply anymore, right? So identify the core problem, question every constraint that you are putting on yourself to solve that problem, and get rid of them, as many of them as you can. This is going to go a little bit against what I said earlier, but I think I'll explain it. The third thing I always think of is create as little as possible in order to solve that problem. I know I said overcreate, but kind of the way I think about this is a number of years ago, I was making a company intranet. It was the first company intranet, right? And so we're making pages for different departments and every page, and we're just using like Google Sites. And so I'm putting like cool banner pictures that have to do with each department and everything. It was fun and great. And then a month goes by and I'm making like the second wave of pages and realize, oh no, I have to find banner images for all of these pages now. And it's like adding 20 minutes for every page I want to create. Going back to question of a constraint, why did I have those banner images? I just decided, okay, that's a bad idea. Let's get rid of them, right? Everything you create has some lasting tail of work, of upkeep, And so you want to be creating, like when you're creating documentation, make it as simple as possible. Make it as unformatted as possible, in order to just, solve the core problem that you're trying to do. And then the final one is, like I said before, shorten the timeline. And that's kind of a forcing function for everything else. You pull on that timeline so that you can't create as much, so that you have to question every assumption, so that you have to know exactly what problem you are solving, or else you can't possibly complete it in time. So that's the 4-step process that I think about from first principles leadership.
I'm going to print this out and then glue it to the side of my computer here, because I feel like all of those things, lengthening the not challenging assumptions, lengthening the timelines tends to be my default behavior. So this is very helpful for me alone. Hopefully some other folks get some benefits out of this. Matt, I love the way your brain works and the frameworks you're able to put together. So I want to thank you for sharing those sort of things and breaking this down into such a consumable way. I think there's tons to take away from this. So thank you for that. As we wrap up here, I know you've got great content out there. You're a great follow. Where can people find more about you? Tell me a little bit about what's available for folks to take advantage of from your business.
Yeah, so I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to find me on LinkedIn, that's pretty easy, and you can connect with me there. BetterEverydayStudios.com is also our website. We have a newsletter, /newsletter if you want to get a little bit tips on leadership development. But definitely, if you are an organization, if you're in your organization trying to figure out how do we help make better frontline managers, I want to talk to you, because I love that. That is when we talk about identifying the core problem, that is the core problem that I and my organization, we are trying to solve right now, is how do we help people transition into that first-time management role in a way that if we build better managers, we can build better companies and then build a better future. That's kind of our vision.
Beautiful. Very well said. Well, please take Matt up on that. He's got lots of greatness to share out there. So Matt, thanks again for being here. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Sean. This has been great.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Adoption Curve. If you've enjoyed today's conversation and want more content like this, I highly recommend subscribing to our newsletter, where we break down insights, frameworks, and templates from our guests on each show. To access, go to iorad.com/newsletter. Also, make sure you subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. If you could, we'd also love it if you could leave us a 5-star review if you enjoyed and got value out of today's conversation. The Adoption Curve is produced by iORAD, the tool that helps thousands of companies make interactive tutorials in seconds. They're shareable in all the tools you use every day. We'll see you on the next episode.